Chicago used to charge big employers a tax for every employee on the payroll. Former Mayor Rahm Emanuel decided it was a job killer and decided to get rid of it. Fast forward to 2025 and Mayor Brandon Johnson has decided to bring something back that's similar, but this time it would fund mental health programs and community safety items. So big business groups actually freaked out a little bit about this, and there was a committee vote that decided that this was not going to happen. Then, of course, shifting the debate to who's going to pay for Chicago's problems. So let's walk through what actually happened and what the data says. And I'm going to provide arguments from both sides on this. But we have to start with what Johnson actually put on the table. So Mayor Johnson's 2026 budget proposal included what City Hall calls a community safety surcharge, but everyone else is just calling it a corporate head tax. It would apply to companies in Chicago that have over 100 employees, but with some pushback with City Hall, that number was increased to 200. Those companies would pay $21 per employee per month if those workers spend more than half their time in Chicago. The Johnson administration says this would raise around $100 million per year and would be used for the new Community Safety Fund. The money is supposed to go towards things like violence prevention, for youth jobs and diversion programs, mental health services, including a crisis intervention team, so we don't have to rely solely on the police, and support for victims of domestic violence. On top of that, Mayor Johnson wants to also propose a social media tax, which is based on how many users they have in the city. This is also to help stabilize some funds that are drying up from COVID relief. So when you hear people say that Johnson wants to tax big businesses to help fund mental health programs, that's pretty much the truth. But of course, the committee decided that they were not going to go forward with this program, which means that Mayor Johnson has to go back to the negotiating table. So the concept of a head tax is still very much alive, but we'll see what happens from here. To understand why this is so controversial, you have to head back in time a little bit. The Civic Federation has a pretty good breakdown on that. They point out that Chicago had a head tax from 1973 to 2014. It was formerly called the Employer's Expense Tax. In its later form, it applied to businesses with over 50 employees, but it was only $4 a month per head. The Civic Federation and the Tax Foundation both note that by the 2000s, the tax brought in about $20 to $23 million per year, sometimes a little bit more and sometimes a little bit less, and that it had not been adjusted for inflation in decades, so the real value is not really clear. So when Rahm Emanuel ran for mayor, he decided that he wanted to get rid of it, calling it a job killer, saying that it would make Chicago's business district less competitive. And of course, by getting rid of this would increase jobs. So they decided to cut the tax by half by 2012 and then completely got rid of it altogether in 2014. So here's the comparison. Old Emanuel era head tax was 50 plus employees, $4 per month per worker, roughly $20 to $30 million a year, and money went into a general revenue and not a dedicated mental health or safety fund. But Johnson's proposed community safety surcharge is 100 or 200 plus employees, depending on which draft you look at, $21 per month per worker, around $100 million a year, and the revenue would go towards Community Safety Fund, which is of course focused on mental health, youth, and violence prevention. The basic structure is still the same, but the scale and purposes are different. Now the big question, did Rahm Emanuel's repeal actually increase job growth? Would bringing a head tax back freeze growth? The Institute for Public Health, which is a progressive policy group, released a report called Modernizing the Head Tax. In that report and in interviews, they lay out some Bureau of Labor statistic numbers. Between 2010 and 2013, which they describe as the post-recession and pre-repeal, Chicago's job growth rate was 66% higher than the national average, even though the head tax was still in place. But between 2014 and 2019, which is the pre-COVID and post-repeal era, Chicago's growth was only 1% above the national average. So their conclusion with this data is there's not really support for the idea that a head tax is a job killer. They also argue that a modernized head tax with a higher rate and higher threshold could raise hundreds of millions of dollars per year while protecting small and medium-sized businesses. Then WBEZ did a whole segment on this, and the basic point in that is that Chicago already relies heavily on regressive revenue, like fines and fees and sales taxes, and that taxing the largest employers more is a way to shift some of that burden upward. So on the data side, what they're saying is that a head tax is not magically going to create more jobs. What they are saying and what they found was that job growth was still increasing even with a head tax, and that the repeal of it did not really promise any job growth either. And there's room to use this tax to grow even further, and it wouldn't really hurt the economy of Chicago very much. Of course, on the other side, business organizations have a different view. The Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce has called Johnson's proposal a tariff on jobs and a job-killing tax. In an October statement, the chamber said that the head tax and the related cloud tax would hurt businesses of all sizes and sectors, and the real answer is long-term growth, not new levies. The Tax Foundation, which is a national tax policy think tank, published a piece on Chicago's 2026 budget, and it criticizes three things: the head tax, the social media user tax, and an expanded cloud tax. And they argue that a head tax directly increases the cost of hiring new employees, and that the social media tax would run into interstate commerce and even constitutional rights. And layering this tax on already increased costs could hurt employment and innovation. The Illinois Policy Institute, which is a right-leaning group, has a similar take. Their analysts said that head taxes discourage employers from hiring because the tax bill goes up each time you add a worker, And they point out that Chicago's slower economic growth compared to other large metros and the recent exodus of corporate headquarters as reasons to avoid anything that sends a negative signal. Even Governor J.B. Pritzker was opposed to this head tax. And so if you zoom out, you see the opposition is really the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce, the Illinois Chamber of Commerce, and Illinois Policy Institute, the national groups like the Tax Foundation, and plus Governor Pritzker. And all of them lining up saying that this is going to make Chicago less competitive and make it harder to attract new workers and businesses. The head tax debate is not just about jobs, though. A big part of Johnson's argument is that Chicago has to repair the damage from earlier decisions on mental health, because in 2012, Rahm Emanuel's budget closed 6 of the city's 12 public mental health clinics. All 50 alderpersons voted for that budget. A few key sources have looked at what happened next. Governing Magazine reported that Chicago went from 12 clinics in 2011 down to 5 by 2018, and that many low-income neighborhoods ended up with very few therapists per resident, while wealthier areas had much higher provider density. The group Southside Together Organizing for Power published a detailed report arguing that the closures affected about 5,300 residents, most of them Black and Latino, and that the city did not replace those services with anything comparable. WBEZ's Reset and other local outlets have covered people who lost care and ended up in emergency rooms or in contact with the police instead. And more recently, there's a peer-reviewed study on this. 2 researchers, Muschow and Laredo, published a paper in the journal Criminology and Public Policy titled Public Mental Health Facility Closures and Criminal Justice Contact in Chicago. And their findings were that they did not see a big spike overall in arrests near the closed clinics, but they do see an increase in police-initiated mental health transports to hospitals from neighborhoods that lost clinics. And in plain language, the police became the front door to emergency mental health care more often, instead of people having stable, long-term access to treatment. That lines up with what some organizations in Chicago are saying. Cutting clinics does not make the problem disappear. It just moves the burden from the police, jails, and ERs. So when Johnson links a new head tax to treatment, not trauma, he's trying to connect those dots. The prior administration removed revenue and closed those programs. Now the city is trying to revive mental health capacity and bring those revenue streams back, along with also creating a crisis response team. So the temporary COVID money is going to run out. So the city has to decide where to replace that revenue or just cut all the programs together. You can agree or disagree with the solution, but this is the details of the plan. Another topic that people focus on here is not so much the head tax, but also about trust. Chicago hired the consulting firm Ernst & Young to do a deep dive on the city's budget and find efficiencies. The EY report cost around $3 million to produce, and it identified between $530 million and $1.4 billion in potential savings and revenue ideas. Some of those ideas are pretty technical, like consolidating functions, changing how overtime is handled, or adjusting fees for services that the city currently provides at a loss. Critics, including former Inspector General Joe Ferguson in an op-ed, said that the administration has not moved aggressively enough on those reforms, and a majority of alderpersons even signed a letter, reported by outlets like The Last Word and ABC7, demanding a special hearing on the EY report and questioning why the city is pushing new taxes before fully using those recommendations. So when you hear people say things like, why don't they just cut the waste first, they are likely talking about this EY report. So here's how all of this lands after going through the research and the arguments. Johnson's proposal was not just some random cash grab. It's a deliberate attempt to tie a tax on large employers and big tech platforms to help fund mental health, violence prevention, and youth programs, especially as the federal money starts to run out. Rahm Emanuel's repeal of the old head tax was sold as a major job creation move, but analysis by the Institute for Public Good reported that Chicago's job growth was already strong with the head tax in place, and it did not noticeably accelerate after the repeal. The Civic Federation is not thrilled about head taxes as a policy tool, but they are also clear that taxes are rarely the only or even the main reason companies choose where to locate. Business groups like the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce and think tanks like the Tax Foundation and Illinois Policy Institute focus much more on the signal this sends about Chicago's business climate. The mental health story is probably the most solid part of this entire debate. The magazine piece, the Stop report, and the Muschow and Laredo study all paint a consistent picture. Closing public clinics did not fix the problem, it just shifted it into ERs and police cars. If there is any place where new, stable funding arguably makes sense, it's in the mental health and crisis response. Most people have this argument when they talk about violence. They always bring up mental health as a source. Well, this is a way to deal with that. And at the same time, the EY report gives people a legitimate reason to ask why the city's not moving faster on internal savings before layering on new taxes. So is the head tax good or bad? It really just depends on where you're coming from. If you're a business owner worried about economic development, this is probably something you're not going to be for. If you're a mental health advocate or a social worker that's seen the inside of what this can do to people, you probably are demanding something as soon as possible. And if you're a homeowner or renter, you're just hoping the city doesn't decline and that your property taxes don't increase to help make up the difference. But I am curious to what you think. Should Chicago bring back a head tax on large employers to help fund things like mental health? Should the city first focus on the EY report and try to squeeze as much savings as they can? Or is this the wrong fight entirely and we need to actually focus more on property taxes and pensions? Or do you have a different idea? If you work for a large employer in Chicago or if you work in mental health and social services, I definitely want to hear from you as well. If you think this breakdown was helpful, please hit subscribe and like the video as well. It really does go a long way, and I hope to hear from you soon.